What's an audiophile? Well, it's a person interested in the highest fidelity reproduction of sound and music that is possible. And this is Audiophile Audition, a unique weekly opportunity to hear the latest in high technology records, tapes, and compact discs before possible purchase. A variety of music types is sampled on Audiophile Audition, plus talks by and interviews with some of the leading figures in audio and music. Audio editor, writer, and producer John Sunier is your host.
Good hearing to you this Easter holiday. Welcome to the first program of a continuing weekly series devoted to the best in music and the best of the different technical approaches to preserve and reproduce that music for your home listening. I'll also briefly explain some of the ways recording engineers and critical listener collectors go about achieving that challenge of state-of-the-art sound reproduction. Audiophile Audition is made possible by a grant from Telarc Digital, pioneers in digital recording of the great classical standards on audiophile LPs and compact discs, and from Yamaha Electronics, offering uncompromised sound reproduction via their new audiophile series of components. On this program, we'll talk to one of the grand old men of audio, Bert Whyte of Audio Magazine, about his work on several early audiophile recording sessions. The formats will include audiophile cassettes, compact discs, direct discs, 45 RPM 12-inch records, and half-speed mastered pressings. Although we're using the high-fidelity FM medium to its fullest, bear in mind that the actual recordings should sound even better when played in your own home. Well, what better way to start than with the rich sound of brass? Battle music intrigued composers from the 16th through the 19th centuries. Samuel Scheit's Battle Suite, published in 1621, takes its name from the fanfare-like character and the answering effects of the flourishes in the upper voices. We'll play an audiophile pre-recorded cassette. It uses the improved Dolby Labs noise reduction system for home use, Dolby C, which effectively eliminates nearly all of the hiss of cassette tapes. From their collection of Renaissance, Elizabethan, and Baroque music, here's the American Brass Quintet. Samuel Scheit's Battle Suite was played by the American Brass Quintet on a Dolby C cassette made from a digital master tape. It's on the Delos label. Our second audiophile recording befits this holiday. It's a tenor aria and the Hallelujah Chorus from the Easter portion of Handel's Messiah. Well, little needs be said about this towering oratorio. You can surely hear it in its entirety later today somewhere on public radio. However, probably not with quite the sonic quality of this digital compact disc, the latest format for consumer recordings. John Humphrey is tenor soloist, with Robert Shaw conducting the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra and Chamber Chorus, and Leighton James harpsichord. Robert Shaw conducted tenor John Humphrey, the Chamber Chorus, and the Atlanta Symphony Orchestra in two excerpts from the Easter section of Messiah by George Friedrich Handel, the aria Thou Shalt Break Them, and the Hallelujah Chorus. That was, of course, apropos of today's special holiday. You heard the music from a rainbow-colored, laser-etched Telarc compact disc on Audiophile Audition, the new public radio program for audio buffs. A syndicated TV program titled The Videophile was recently launched, and computer fans have several programs devoted to their interests. So isn't it time we golden ears have our own program too? Right. The audiophile phenomenon was really launched in the early 1970s with the first direct discs. Actually, this was nothing new, since from Edison's invention until the advent of tape recording, all recordings were direct disc, or direct cylinder as the case may be. Audiophile perfectionists felt the added step of magnetic tape in the recording chain obscured some of the realism that could be achieved by feeding directly from the mics and mixer to the master cutting lathe. Of course, you couldn't do editing any longer, so performers were under a lot of pressure, especially in recording the classics. Jazz came out better. Here's a successful direct disc, one of the 4 romantic pieces, Opus 75, by Dvorak. The performers under pressure are Arnold Steinhardt, violin, and Lincoln Mayorga, piano. The Allegro Moderato from Dvorak's 4 romantic pieces for violin and piano, played by Arnold Steinhardt and Lincoln Mayorga. That's on a direct disc from Sheffield Lab, the label who originated the direct disc approach and still do it. One of the characteristics of most audiophiles is an adventurousness in the types of music they enjoy hearing well reproduced. The sheer sensual beauty of some instruments can be a really dynamic experience. Here's an example. Was Paraguayan harp virtuoso Ignacio Alderete in Frederico, from a collection titled Magician of the Indian Harp. It's a compact disc struck from an analog master tape on the Pierre Verani label. By the way, analog means the old familiar way of recording, actual sounds going on the tape or disc rather than thousands of digits representing the sound events. Another approach to improved sonics is to play the master analog tape at half normal speed and also rotate the cutting lathe at half speed. The results are, of course, played back at the normal speed, otherwise it would really sound strange. Hopefully the improvements in clarity and lowered distortion will be worth it. Like to hear a sample? Okay, here's Eugene Ormandy, the great interpreter of the music of Sibelius, to conduct the Philadelphia Orchestra in that composer's Lemminkainen's Return. Lemminkainen's Return by Sibelius. The Philadelphia Orchestra was conducted by Eugene Ormandy. The original recording was made by Angel EMI, but we heard a half-speed mastered release from Mobile Fidelity, a label that's devoted to this format. You're hearing Public Radio's weekly sound excursion for music lovers and golden ears, Audiophile Audition. Our weekly interview with a leader in the audio and music fields is next. Bert Whyte has had a long career of engineering audiophile recording sessions and writing about audio and music. His monthly column in Audio Magazine is widely read. He's been associated with such pioneers in top fidelity recording as Mercury Living Presence, Everest, and Crystal Clear. I spoke with Bert at the January Consumer Electronics Show. We were in a room next door to a loudspeaker demonstration room, so our chat is accompanied by a wonderful medley of this season's favorite musical blockbusters for speaker evaluation. Following our short talk, you'll hear a bit from one of the pioneering Everest 35mm recordings that he mentions, from the first stereo Mahler Symphony recording.
The early experience with Everest, which I founded with Harry Belloc, we took an entirely purist attitude in that company. Harry was a fanatic in terms of absolute quality for everything. So
you were the first to record on 35mm
film. We introduced 35mm magnetic film, which is a sprocketed film, which is used in the movie industry, and the sprocketed film would give you a much steadier signal. In other words, in terms of wow and flutter as compared to a tape machine, it was much steadier because of the sprocketing there. There was a much thicker coating on the tape. And of course, we did 3 channels of a recording, and this is on 35mm tape.
Right.
So each of the channels was equivalent to a full track 1/4 inch. So that helped the signal to noise ratio. Now, of course, back then we did not have any Dolby noise reduction. This really got underway in 1958. But because of the fact that you had very wide tracks and utilized them fully, a 1/4 inch track for each channel, we were getting a signal noise ratio of close to 70 dB, which is rather remarkable for its day, and the ability, of course, to put on quite a bit of dynamic range. We recorded strictly 3 channels, and 3 channels with the view of post-mixing the central channel if it needed to go up or down, depending on the situation, but again with the ultimate goal someday true 3-channel sound. We did an awful lot of pioneering musically as well.
Yes.
I did the very first stereo recording of Mahler symphonies. The Mahler first with Sir Adrian Pohl.
I have that on a 2-track pre-recorded tape from Everest, just magnificent.
Right.
Sounds
and then we did premiere works with a lot of the composers themselves conducting. We did, for example, the Copland Third Symphony and Billy the Kid with Aaron Copland conducting. We were doing the world premiere of the Vaughan Williams Ninth Symphony.
Yes.
With Sir Adrian Boult, who of course was the master interpreter of Ralph Vaughan Williams, and so he met me at the back door of Walthamstow, which is the preferred hall in England that all of us like to use. And you know, Sir Adrian is a very tall, about 6'4", and a very austere type of gentleman. And he says, "Oh, Mr. Whyte, I have some terrible news." And I said, "Oh my word, what now, you know?" And he said, "Ralph Vaughan Williams died just 4 hours ago and cannot be with us on the session today as he had hoped," and so on. So it was a very dramatic thing because the orchestra didn't know this, and they were very fond of Vaughan Williams, so Sir Adrian announced at the start of the session. And then, very unusually, we recorded him saying that, as you know, Ralph Vaughan Williams was supposed to have been with us, but he died just 4 hours ago, and we thank our American friends for making this recording possible. So it's very unusual to have a recording start like that. We had Malcolm Arnold, who is now master of the Queen's Musik, as they say, Sir Malcolm Arnold now, and we had him conducting some of his works, and we had Villalobos doing some of his, and so forth. We tried to get, not that the composer is always the best interpreter of the music, as witness Stravinsky's stuff, and some people like Stravinsky's interpretations, but we did a lot of very unusual repertoire. In other words, my feeling right at the start was that if I came out with another Beethoven Fifth and a Tchaikovsky Sixth, no matter how well it was recorded, they'd say, "Well, that's nice, you know." Harold Schonberg, the famous critic of the New York Times and so on, gave us quite a good send-off, saying, you know, no hackneyed repertoire, etc., and so on. And that sort of set the tone.
Because that was about the only, I guess, I don't know if people called it audiophile back then, but really called it Day and Mercury, Living Presence. That was about it.
Yeah, that's exactly it. The microphones were mostly, well, they started out in life as U-47 Neumann Telefunkens. But there's a man in Hollywood, Frank Church, who modified these considerably. There was a bit of a peak at 13K on some of those microphones. So he modified them to get rid of that peak and to increase the sensitivity. We used mostly that, and we used some AKG stereo microphones, the earlier versions, C12 and so forth. But it was always minimal. 3 microphones, usually 5 microphones tops. We were in existence 3 years, and the whole thing was sold, and you won't believe, but it was sold to the Diners Club. The entire catalog was sold to the Diners Club, and then subsequently to a gentleman called Ernie Solomon, who to this day has the Everest label, but he uses it as sort of a high-class umbrella for a lot of lesser labels and so on. My recordings are still being turned out on what I would call a high grade of concrete.
Yes, I agree.
Sorry to say. There have been several reissue situations. One was a short-lived company called, I think, Sweet Thunder, who reissued the Billy the Kid of Copland, and the Petrushka did with the Eugene Goosens. And then a company in England called Della Arte, I guess it is, took the Francesca di Rimini of Tchaikovsky that I had done with Stokowski in the New York Philharmonic, and reissued that, and it's known as one of the most thrilling performances of that particular work, as well as the recording. The other interesting aspect, which your listeners might be interested in hearing, is that all the 35mm magnetic film equipment was then sold to Bob Fine of Mercury Records, which is when Mercury Records started to come.
In Russia with Byron Janis.
Right, and of course the stuff that was done with Enoch Light.
Oh, yes.
That was also done that way and so on.
So that all used the same equipment?
All the same equipment. It came right from our Bayside studios.
An excerpt from the second movement of Gustav Mahler's First Symphony, with the London Philharmonic conducted by Sir Adrian Boult. Before that, this week's audio celebrity, recording engineer and audio writer Bert Whyte. That recording, engineered by Mr. Whyte, was from a 2-track pre-recorded Everest tape of 27 years ago. Quite a sonic achievement, I think you'll agree. Now to an instrument often regarded as one of the most difficult to record and reproduce properly, the piano. This instrument's wide dynamic range, that is, from soft to loud, its percussive character, presenting steep wave fronts or transients to the recording equipment, and its great sensitivity to variations in speed are part of the problem. Also, we're all familiar with exactly how a piano sounds in the flesh. The ecstatic piano music of Alexander Scriabin has plenty of those transients. Listen to Towards the Flame, a direct disc recorded by Marta Deanova. Marta Deanova performed Scriabin's Towards the Flame. Although fewer direct discs are produced today and many are out of print, this one is available on the Nimbus label. You're listening to Audiophile Audition, Public Radio's new program for audio buffs. San Francisco's Kronos String Quartet is one of the world's foremost contemporary music ensembles. Over 100 new works have been premiered by Kronos, and the next album up, In Formation, features 10 of the most accessible of these. The short pieces bridge many musical worlds: rock, jazz, country, folk, and classical. This is a 12-inch, 45 RPM album, but with more music per side than the dance mix 12-inch albums that you may have seen. The higher speed allows a greater dynamic range. Several decibels, that's a measure of relative sound level, more than you'd get at 33 1/3 speed. Here is The Junk Food Blues by John Whitney, the Kronos Quartet. The Kronos Quartet in The Junk Food Blues, from their reference recordings, that's the name of the label, 45 RPM speed album titled In Formation. Our final music this week comes from a compact disc demo of live jazz performances. It's unavailable commercially. The sessions were taped digitally in SQ surround sound, which some of you may remember from the quad fizzle of a dozen or so years ago. At various Southern California jazz clubs, top artists were recorded, including the Jazz on Vibes legend, Lionel Hampton. He plays Avalon.
Now we have a tune by special request to have Teddy Wilson to play that beautiful piano that he always played.
Lionel Hampton and his quartet played Avalon, one item on a jazz demo CD from Sony, concluding this week's program. For next week, I've scheduled a program of audiophile war horses, both classical and jazz varieties, plus a talk with classical producer Harold Lawrence. Your comments and suggestions for future programs are also invited. And tell us what station you hear us on. Good hearing to you. This week is a special for all the analog audio proponents out there. It's my quarterly program presenting music entirely from audiophile vinyl LPs. You may not see many LPs in the average record stores anymore, but the truth is there's an active, though small, LP business in both new and used records, much of it by mail order. There are regular LP conventions in many major cities where fans hungry for those 12-inch vinyl pizzas get together and buy, sell, and trade. There are also some brand new audiophile LP labels now in operation, and I'll let you audition a few of them today. To go along with the recordings in these dying days of the LP, some unassailably good sonic advances have been made in the mechanics and the electronics of analog reproduction. Better turntables, tone arms, cartridges, and phonosections of high-end preamps have resulted in analog reproduction that stays ahead of digital as both improve gradually, ahead at least in those parameters that are of most importance to vinyl enthusiasts. All audiophile LPs today. Let's get underway with our first vinyl LP now. It's a collection from Norway of works for wind quintet, and I've selected the finale of one such work composed in 1943 by John Fernstrom. The Norwegian Wind Quintet will be heard. This week's audiophile LP edition of Audiophile Audition has opened with the music of John Fernstrom, the finale from his Quintet for Wind Instruments, Opus 59, played by the Norwegian Wind Quintet. This is one of 3 wind quintets on a Simax label LP from Norway. That's SIMAX. The other 2 composers are Carl Nielsen and Antonio Bipalo. The recordings were made with a single Schoeps stereo microphone in a Bloomline pattern, and they were taped without noise reduction on a Nagra recorder. For this week's audio hints, I thought I'd talk about some of the extra preparation that goes into these all-LP programs. First, with a new LP, I initially remove its shrink wrap and throw it away. It generates static charges. If I want extra protection, such as with some of my collector's Golden Age Mercury and RCA Red Seal LPs, I use a heavy 3mm plastic outside sleeve. Next, I lightly dust off both sides of the LP with a clean powder puff. Then the LP moves to the turntable of my record cleaning machine. If it's even slightly warped, I have to screw it down with a hold-down bushing. The LP is then rotated and scrubbed lightly but vigorously with VPI cleaning fluid, which after a while generates a bit of a phone. The suction part of the record cleaning machine is then turned on, and the side continues to revolve about 2 or 3 revolutions until it's completely dry on that side. Then it's removed, and the process repeated on the other side. While I do this, I listen to something loud, like brass music or traditional jazz, because the vacuum motor is very noisy. I normally clean a batch of LPs that have piled up, and each is laid on top of its inner sleeve in small stacks, so that if there's any drops of moisture remaining from the cleaning operation, they can evaporate until the next step. This involves moving the stack of clean LPs to the area of my turntable. With certain collectors, LPs, and test LPs, I then treat them with Last record preservative, but this time I'm skipping that additional step. You may find that LPs can actually sound somewhat noisier the first time, but only the first time they are played after the last treatment. But after that, they are fully protected if you play them frequently. I will just treat each side with Groove Glide, the only safe and effective record lubricant I've found. First, I turn off the vacuum feature of my turntable and set the speed to 45 RPM. 78 would be even better, but this turntable doesn't have it. I spray a clean powder puff applicator twice with 1-second sprays of the Groove Glide, and then apply it lightly to the LP side as it spins at 45 RPM. If the side is recorded all the way to the label, I slide the powder puff in slightly to cover all of the grooves. 5 or 10 seconds a side usually does it, and then I repeat this for the other side. I affix a colored marker to the upper right-hand corner of each treated LP. Actually, I use a large colored circle for the cleaned LPs and then a smaller color dot inside the circle for those which have also been groove glided. Oh, we're not quite done yet. Now, before actually playing the LP, I need to turn the vacuum feature back on. Vacuum is not found on certain of the most expensive turntables. It has its pros and cons that are too complex to go into here. It is also, of course, I change the speed back to 33 1/3. I make sure the mat is perfectly clean. I use a small brush for this. Next, I clean the stylus with a vibrating stylus cleaner and a special stylus cleaning fluid. If you use a manual brush, be sure to move it from back to front only, never in the other direction, or goodbye diamond stylus. Finally, I touch the stylus tip with Stylast from Last, which, with the Groove Glide, makes a synergistic combination that reduces friction and, along with it, surface noise, while increasing high-end response and clarity by making a more perfect interface between the stylus and the grooves. If the LP is not one that I just cleaned and treated, I'll have to clean it lightly with a carbon fiber brush or a very clean and dry powder puff that is frequently shaken out. Then the really final step is to zap the disc with a disc washer zero-stat gun, or one of the similar equivalents. This is to counteract the static charges that were generated by all of the cleaning operations, especially the dry brush. I didn't include some of the points about spreading the cardboard jacket, holding the LP by the center hole and edge and keeping your mitts off it, and replacing the abrasive inner paper sleeves or the plastic bags inside the paper sleeves, which are even worse, with better and thicker plastic inner sleeves, but I suspect that most listeners have heard about these things before. So that's it. See all the trouble now that I'm going to for you? And in spite of all this, vinyl junkies still feel the best CDs can't come close to the sonic pleasures of their analog world. Well, what are some of these parameters of reproduction that are so important to vinyl enthusiasts, you may be asking? Well, to my ear, they include a more natural string tone on some recordings, although recent CDs have improved the digititis that many string sections suffered from on CD at the beginning. A more realistic reproduction of very low-level information in spite of the surface noise of LPs. Greater clarity in the major climaxes of the full orchestra. Many CDs tend to sound rather bunched up and opaque at this point. More cues about the size of the venue and its shape, the reflections from the ceilings and walls and so on, this ambience, and more air around the performers. It's something like playing around with Gertrude Stein's quote about Oakland. You might say the musicians are more there with vinyl analog reproduction on a good turntable with a good system than with many CDs. At least that's what the vinyl fans are saying. I'm John Sunier, and this is Audiophile Audition, where each week we present some of the most successful manifestations of the urge to coax the musical genie into the recording bottle. This week, it's coaxing that genie into the vinyl grooves, because our theme is all audiophile LPs. Today's program is a very special one. It comes to you during the station's pledge period. I have some rare sounds for you this time, coming entirely from an audiophile recording format that was once regarded as the ultimate, and it still is in some quarters, open-reel pre-recorded tape. We'll be auditioning together music of Elgar, Reinberger, Stravinsky, Ibert, and others, and for the regular interview part of the program, I have a guest from the past, audio pioneer Emory Cook. He produced the first stereo LPs years before the major record labels did. With standard analog magnetic tape, the greater the speed of the tape across the heads of the tape deck, the better is the fidelity. While 7.5 inches per second has become the standard for most radio programs on tape, and it was the standard for home recording for decades, most professional studio music recording is done at 15 inches per second. There are even some machines that operate at a dizzying 30 inches per second. When pre-recorded reel tapes first came on the market in the 1950s, they were all at 7.5 speed, except for a few duplicated at 3 3/4, half the speed, in order to save cost on tape stock. None of these were available at the 15 inches per second speed, because with a standard tape, a 7-inch reel would then hold only 15 minutes of music in a single direction. However, during the 70s and 80s, different approaches were tried in order to achieve higher fidelity for audio buffs. Among these were 12-inch LPs that spun at 45 RPM or even 78 RPM, direct-to-discs, DBX encoded LPs, and tapes. At hand, I have one of a small series of classical and jazz recordings that were issued by Romanus Recording in Connecticut and duplicated in real time at 15 inches per second double-track stereo. Of course, this required a large 10.5-inch metal reel and a large box, and it was prohibitively expensive. But by today's standards of the cost of some high-end audio hardware, maybe not really so expensive after all. Audio engineer Peter McGrath made this particular recording. He used purist single-point mic techniques and special Mark Levinson recording equipment. We're going to audition here on Audiophile Audition, the first movement of the Serenade for Strings by Edward Elgar. Barry Diamond conducts the Pro Musica Chamber Orchestra. The opening movement of Elgar's Serenade for Strings. The Pro Musica Chamber Orchestra was conducted by Barry Diamond. That came from a large open-reel tape that ran at 15 inches per second. It has less than 30 minutes total on it. It was created for tape-loving audio buffs about 15 years ago. It was on the Romanus recording label. This is Audiophile Audition. The next tape comes from the same source as the first one, Romanus Recordings. This 10.5-inch reel, recorded at 15 inches per second speed in 2-track stereo, has space for only a single selection, the 3-movement Organ Concerto No. 2 in G minor of Reinberger. This was taped by Peter McGrath at a live concert by the Pro Musica Chamber Orchestra, conducted again by Barry Diamond. The organ soloist is Joanne Schulte, and will sample the 3rd movement of the concerto. Joanne Schulte was the organ soloist in the final movement of the Organ Concerto No. 2 in G minor by Reinberger. The Pro Musica Chamber Orchestra was conducted by Barry Diamond on the recording made by Peter McGrath for Romanus Recordings. Again, this is a now out-of-print, real-time duplicated, 15-inch per second double-track open-reel tape. It demonstrates a past music format for audiophiles that equaled and sometimes surpassed the sound of today's best commercial CDs. Concert music of any sort is becoming a rarity in general on radio airwaves in the United States. The 20 or so remaining commercial concert music stations are slowly folding up and switching over to more commercially viable music formats. Even in public radio, many classical format stations are cutting back their hours of classical programming, and a number of them have switched to all news, all talk formats. Many public stations that do air classical music have extremely tight restrictions on exactly which classical music they'll air, based on questionable surveys that claim to show that listeners will immediately turn them off should they hear even short examples of such music types as vocals, pipe organ, solo strings, new music, or percussion. Well, from that little list you can probably deduce that none of that type of classical public station are now carrying Audiophile Audition. Even in the area of 18th and 19th century orchestral and chamber works, I tend to take the less well-beaten track in an effort to let listeners hear some unique sounds that I feel many CD collectors might like to have for their very own collections. This program provides a sort of alternative to the concert music that you can hear most anywhere. For example, I haven't aired one note from the Rachmaninoff Piano Concerto No. 3 in years, and I'm certainly not going to air any of David Helfgott's recent CD, no matter how great a film I found Shine to be. So it can be said that the station to which you are now listening is going to be somewhat against the grain of prevailing policy at many public radio stations who seek high ratings first and high-quality, varied programming second. Add to this the restrictions that many stations have on airing any syndicated programming other than Morning Edition and All Things Considered. Many, all or nearly all concert music public radio stations ignore the many excellent produced classical programs that are available at a flip of the switch from the NPR satellite, and they employ only local hosts announcing their classical CDs. The staff at your local station finds that specially produced programs like mine and those of some of my colleagues add interest and diversity to the broadcast schedule, so they download Audiophile Audition from the satellite and bring it to you every week. The final result is that I want to express my gratitude to this station for airing Audiophile Audition. And if you listen regularly and feel the same way, you should let this station know your feelings. This is John Sunier again, with more of this special Audiophile Audition that focuses on pre-recorded tape. For those of you who might be new to this program, each week I feature a short interview with a personality in the worlds of either music or audio. For this program, I have an interview that I taped about a decade ago with one of the true pioneers in audio, Emory Cook. His path-breaking work, done entirely on his own and without big-budget corporate support, began in 1950 with his first long-play records that used common-sense approaches to get much better sound in the grooves than most of the big commercial record labels. A couple years later, he introduced the world's first commercial stereo LPs. That was half a dozen years before the single-groove stereo LPs we know today were brought out by the major labels. Here is my interview with Emory Cook, done with my hi-fi phone technique from his home in Connecticut, where, as I last heard, he still lives in retirement.
Your catalog of long-play records really was the spearheader of a whole trend in high fidelity, and had a lot of effect upon the kinds of recordings that other people have done over the years, even down to today.
Well, that was entirely accidental. You know, I just got started in this thing because it annoyed me that all the good records that were made seemed to come from England.
Aha.
And everything.
That was the FFRR record in 78s and so on?
Yeah, sure. That was actually was in the 78
yes.
days. Somebody, I think it may have been, I don't know if you heard of them, Columbia. I moved into LP.
And the early LPs were pretty bad, weren't they?
Oh, yeah, sure. Oh, horrible.
So
they were made out of the same compound that made 78s mostly.
Yes. So you already had a recording studio?
The recording studio that I used was in a suitcase. With the idea you record in the natural, go on the road. That's the one thing the big companies can't do, with the exception of Frank Walker of RCA, who collected all kinds of folk music and hillbilly.
What sort of tape recorder did you use?
Well, the first stereo were called binaural in those years.
Right.
Was made by Magnacorder.
What did you use for mics?
Condenser microphones that were made by Capps and Company, the same people that make Stiley.
Yes. Were the first recordings you did that big series of the steel band and calypso recordings?
No. Oh, I think we started out with a railroad record, bagpipes, music box record may have been the first. I think that may have been the case.
Had that sort of thing hadn't really been done on 78s, had it?
Well, it hadn't been done at all.
Yes.
I mean, who needs records of music boxes? Come on, Cook, you're crazy.
Right.
Will you stop that?
How did you decide on these particular
well, they were
sounds
available
to record?
They were available. Yeah. Yeah. It's pretty hard to pay an orchestra when you've got nothing to pay them with.
Yes.
Yeah. Except promises.
I see. And then what were the first stereo recordings you did?
There was some piano and, of course, organ.
Yes, that was one of the first that really got down to the low frequencies, down to 32 cycles and so on.
There wasn't much around that anybody could play in those years that had any bottom end in it. As a matter of fact, I suspect that it's still fairly much that way.
Yes. And you also then found a way to through a very unusual approach to be able to play back the stereo records long before the stereo disc was introduced in 1958.
Well, if nobody else does it, and you want to do it, you got to do it yourself. That's about it. It's always cheaper to buy it if it's made, but it wasn't made, so you do it yourself.
Right. So it was the one that was basically two cartridges in a double arm and two sets of grooves cut on one side of the record.
Yes. Yeah.
I remember hearing some of those back then and trying to synchronize the two grooves, and when they were, it was pretty fantastic.
Yeah, well, sometimes it worked.
How did you begin doing the big series of calypso recordings in the Caribbean?
Let's put it this way: the West Indian, some of them like music better than food. At least it's on a par with food. You find people buying records and putting them on the wall until they get a gramophone. Well, that's a condition that needs some attention.
Were there any the situations that were especially difficult to record, or where there were interesting problems in recording?
They were all difficult to record. Voice of the Sea was pretty hard.
Yes,
yeah.
That you had to travel to many locations for that one. Right?
Yeah.
Wasn't there one of the calypso records or steel band records where there was quite a good tweeter test of a cricket that was under the porch of the house?
If you take a steel band indoors, you go out of your mind. Some people have, in those years, tried that, and it doesn't work. It's bad enough already outdoors without any reverberation at all. But when you take it indoors, then it's completely hopeless. Well, if it's outdoors, it's going to be crickets. Either that, or you take them into, let's say, the northern part of Canada where there aren't any crickets, or someplace with no crickets at all, and record them there. Which is, and then if you do that, then people don't behave the same way, perform the same way when they're off their own territory. This is just like any pipe organ. Let's not talk about electronic organs. They're just fine for what they're used for and so forth. But the pipe organ is a monster pneumatic assembly of joints and pipes and cables and valves and all that. Anybody who has run any kind of shop, including a garage, knows that you can't have air in the place and no leaks. And the opportunity for little leaks in a pipe organ. See, so of course, when compressed air leaks a little somewhere, and in this case it would be many different places, some hiss is engendered. And so the hiss sounds like surface noise. Therefore, something's the matter with you people. You don't seem to be able to make a quiet record.
Right. You also introduced a new way of pressing records, didn't you?
Oh, yeah.
Microfusion?
Oh, yeah. Well, that arose from the what I thought was the condition. You couldn't buy consistently, reliably good pressing.
Yes. So what was different about your process? It used a powder, is that it?
The vinyl compound was not subjected to a huge heat history. Heat history destroys plastics. You can burn. There's no plastic that you can't burn out. All plastics will succumb to heat. The question is, it's not just the temperature; it's how long. Our cycle time was very, very short.
I see. So in this case, a shorter cycle time was an advantage rather than a disadvantage.
The vinyl was not abused. Yes.
I see.
Yeah. We like to abuse the customers instead of the vinyl. How's that? Try that one out.
You've heard my interview with audio pioneer Emory Cook, who inspired many of those in my generation to become interested in ways to achieve more realistic sound through both recording software and the reproduction on fine audio components. I taped that interview about a decade ago. Audiophile Audition began as a local program in San Francisco about 17 years ago, and it just observed its 12th anniversary on the national airwaves, with about 120 stations carrying it every week. You know, speaking of recording sounds on tape, I've always been befuddled when people to whom I mention some great program on public radio tell me that they seldom listen to anything but the news programs, Morning Edition or All Things Considered. They say it's because either they're not home or too busy when the shows air, or they forget when special weekly programs air. Nearly everyone has a VCR in their home today, and many of them are used to time-shift TV programs. But only a very few people seem to ever think of also using them to time-shift public radio programs in order to fit their schedules and needs. If they used their handy VCRs to tape radio programs, they'd find even more value in their local public radio service. It couldn't be easier to do, if you've moved past eliminating the flashing 12 o'clock on your screen, that is. Most units are simple to set up for the day and time of regular weekly programs, and all you need to do is feed the output of your tuner, receiver, or table radio into the audio inputs of your VCR. That's all there is to it. You can record at the slowest speed for most programs if you have a hi-fi VCR. It'll still sound very good. It's also fairly easy to time-shift your favorite programs to audio cassette. Then you have the ability to take the tapes with you in your car when you go for walks or work in the garden with a portable Walkman. 120-minute cassettes are a bit hard to find today, but they still make them, and then you can put a 1-hour program such as Audiophile Audition on each side of the cassette. If you have an auto-reverse deck, you can tape 2-hour programs continually. Hooking up a timer to a tape deck is a bit more complicated than doing it with a VCR timer, but instructions come with the outboard timers. Radio Shack has the Micronta audio timer, which is inexpensive and works just great. Get into time shifting and you'll appreciate the vast resources of your public radio station's varied schedule even more than you do now, mark my word. I personally time shift 3 or 4 favorite public radio programs every week and then listen to them in my cars or on hikes. And they're completely free of the multipath reception noises experienced with a moving FM radio in the area where I live. By the way, don't fear retribution from the authorities for taping. It's perfectly legal for your personal use. Just don't sell Audiophile Audition tapes to your audio buddies. One of the early companies to offer pre-recorded stereo tapes back in the mid-1950s, before the introduction of today's stereo LPs, was Sonotape Corporation. All of their original recordings came from the Westminster label. That label had an excellent library of material, but their standard LPs were so noisy and murky sounding that I remember back at the station where I started out, we called them Westmonster. Well, releasing some of those master tapes on double-track, pre-recorded tape at 7.5 showed that these were actually terrific recordings, and Westminster just had lousy LP pressings. Here's an example, a section from the middle of the instrumental music for Stravinsky's chamber theater piece for 7 players and narrator, titled The Soldier's Tale. This is a very acoustically dry space, but just listen to the impact and realism of each individual instrument. Robert Mandel conducts Ars Nova from a sonotape.
The last of the pre-recorded stereotapes on this special Pledge Drive edition of Audiophile Audition has been the music of Igor Stravinsky. Instrumental excerpts from the middle section of L'Histoire du Soldat, The Soldier's Tale. The instrumentalists included the well-known clarinetist Stanley Drucker. Robert Mandel conducted Ars Nova on a sonotape, a pre-recorded 7-inch reel at 7.5 inches per second from the masters of Westminster Records. Our focus for this week is the harpsichord. If you're in agreement with Sir Thomas Beecham, who quipped something along the line of harpsichords sounding like two skeletons making the sign of the three-toed sloth on a corrugated tin roof, then you probably won't relish this week's program theme. However, if you find that the unique crystalline voice of the harpsichord is absolutely appropriate for hearing the beauty of all of the voices in the music of the 17th and 18th centuries, then you'll thoroughly enjoy the 9 selections from recent CDs coming up during the next hour. This is probably the most talked about but never heard lost soundtrack score to one of the greatest sci-fi movies ever made, 2001: A Space Odyssey. Stanley Kubrick hired film music great Alex North, he did Streetcar Named Desire and Spartacus, among others, to score his newest film. He was evidently pushed to do this by his studio, MGM, who wanted an original score composed. The reality of it was that Kubrick had become very attached to the scratch tracks from various classical LPs that he'd been using for 2 years now, together with the screen footage that he was shooting. These tracks included some Ligeti works, Khachaturian ballet music, the Blue Danube Waltz, and the opening to Also Sprach Zarathustra, among others. North worked with Kubrick to create the score for about the first half of 2001, but then he was told that his services were no longer needed. The composer later attended the New York premiere of the ultimate science fiction film, and he was shocked to find that not a single note of his music had been used. The entire soundtrack consisted of the various classical recordings that had been married to the images from the start. Well, through the good intentions of another great film composer, Jerry Goldsmith, and Varese Sarabande Records, the original North score for 2001 has now been resurrected and recorded, with Goldsmith conducting the National Philharmonic Orchestra. It makes for a fascinating comparison with the images if you happen to have the Laserdisc or tape. Frankly, I think Kubrick did the right thing, though it would have been more decent to tell North what he was doing in advance. Let's hear the cue for the opening Dawn of Man scene, the one with the apes. Jerry Goldsmith has conducted the National Philharmonic Orchestra in one of the 2 versions of music for the Dawn of Man scene in Stanley Kubrick's 2001: A Space Odyssey. This is the world premiere recording of the legendary Lost original score by Alex North, which was never used in the final film. It's quite a short CD because Kubrick had told North to stop composing at about the halfway point in the score, claiming he was going to use just breathing sounds for the rest of the film, which of course wasn't true. It's on the Varese Sarabande label. This one also brings down the curtain on this week's recent soundtrack CDs. So get up, unstick your feet, and leave. Good hearing to you. Welcome to the national program for music-loving audio buffs and sound-conscious music lovers, Audiophile Audition. Each week for over 13 years, we've sampled concert music CDs of both sonic and musical importance that you might want to add to your own collection. And we've talked about enjoying the best reproduction of that music. I'm your host, John Sunier, and now it's my unhappy duty to tell you that this will be the final national broadcast of Audiophile Audition. After nearly 700 unrepeated hour programs since 1985, the program will close down. Please don't be upset with your local station for canceling Audiophile Audition. On the contrary, I want to express my gratitude to both my stations and my listeners for supporting the program for all of these years, or as many years as your local station has been airing it. Both public broadcasting and the audio industry are changing rapidly. The trend is away from 1-hour weekly syndicated music programs such as Audiophile Audition. And with the world going to digital audio in both recording and broadcast, it must be admitted that FM broadcasting in the U.S. is still stuck with a seriously outmoded technology that really dates back to the 1930s. Not exactly ideal for showcasing the latest in 5.1 channel digital surround sound. Well, in spite of this unexpected news for some of you, I do have a program and a special theme for this final audiophile audition. It happens to be unexpected instruments. It's something I've been wont to do occasionally over the years on the final program of each quarter period. Among the unexpected instruments we'll audition are a pair of cellos, a pair of cimbalams, some panpipes, some handbells, a recorder quartet, accordion, saxophone, and organ together, a baritone, and a computer-controlled synthesizer. Our music hints will also be on the rather appropriate subject of silences in music. So join me now for some unexpected instruments during the next hour. For our very last music news or music hints, I have a column from the current issue of BBC Music Magazine titled The Sounds of Silence. Seems appropriate. It begins one late winter day as I stood in the garden of a villa among the ruins of Pompeii. I commented to the custodian, my only companion, on the stillness of the setting. "Did you know that there are more than 9 muses?" he said. "There's a 10th one, created by the Romans. She is Tacita, the muse of silence." Silence surrounds music, which arises from stillness like islands rising from the sea. And Tacita can be found in all her splendid diversity, disporting with sound in the finest musical compositions of every historical period. Quite spontaneously, I've used silence as a means of expression, Debussy wrote to Chausson. It's perhaps the only means of bringing into relief the emotional value of a phrase. And 3 centuries earlier, Carlo Gesualdo practiced such artistry no less consummately. The moments of silence in his daringly chromatic madrigals still have a double effect: on the audience as preliminary to a considerable harmonic shock, and on the singers as preparatory to a desperate attempt to find the pitch of the next note. In this account, which makes not the remotest attempt to be comprehensive, I'll cite a few of my favorite examples of silences in music. He first talks about Haydn, who had a special sensibility in this respect, in the second movement of his Symphony No. 88, where each of the hymn-like phrases ends haltingly, modestly, an eloquent expression of the deep humility of the composer who wrote on his scores in nomine Domini. He could use silences in the service of uproarious humor, too, as in the finale of Symphony No. 90, where the work seems to end in a jubilant affirmation of the home key, C major, only to continue 4 silent bars later, pianissimo, in D-flat major. Next, he talks about Beethoven, who fully grasped the value of Tacita's art and applied it with unsurpassed imagination and refinement. In certain slow introductions, such as the Cello Sonata, Opus 5/2, and the Fourth Symphony and his second Leonora Overture, giant moments of silence intensify the sense of expectancy to the breaking point. The division of pain and love is inherent in the first movement of the B-flat Piano Sonata. The extended rests arch over a mystical abyss between the darkly sinister trills in the bass and a serenely consoling principal theme. Near the conclusion of the A major Sonata, D 595, the winged, leet-like melody is interrupted 5 times in its mid-flight, the thematic fragments traversing a world of enchanted modulation. Among many examples in later music, I'd mention the opening 15 bars of the prelude to Tristan and Isolde, in which Wagner alternates silences with phrases of melodic and harmonic yearning in order to trace with precisely judged instinct the growing intensity of the effect of the love potion. At the end of Sibelius's Fifth Symphony, the inexorable forward movement of the monumental Thor's Hammer theme ceases at its apex, leaving one suspended in silences of awe and wonderment as 6 mighty isolated chords, like craggy rune stones poised at the summit, bring the work to a conclusion. A composer can write a rest, but it's of course up to the performer to convey its meaning. Rests look neutral on paper, but each carries its own expressive implication. Many performers feel uncomfortable, even embarrassed, when faced with an extended silence. They tend to cheat and hurry things up. Not so Pablo Casals, who spoke of the art of the rest. of giving the rest its just due while maintaining an unbroken line of feeling. Nor a Wilhelm Furtwängler who would let the world stop in its tracks to experience the enormous expressive power inherent in a moment of silence. The pianist Arthur Schnabel once said, "The notes I handle no better than many pianists, but the pauses between the notes, that is where the art resides." Pianist Richard Good explains further, "I believe that certain rests in some of the dramatic pieces of Beethoven are meant to be slightly extended, but one has to decide case by case whether it's more important to retain the metrical clarity or to stress the psychological significance. The important thing is that the relationship of sound and silence gives shape to the music's intrinsic character. It should be emphasized here that natural-sounding rhythmic proportions do not always correspond to metronomic exactitude, or, in the unfortunate parlance used in some quarters, to playing it straight. Overall, there should be a constancy, but within a given phrase there can be a lot more rhythmic irregularity than many performers allow for. There is often an implied silence at the end of a piece, say the conclusion of Beethoven's piano sonatas opus 109 and 111. It can be considered as belonging to the work itself. Busoni spoke of the tense silence between two movements as being in itself music, leaving wider scope for divination than the more determinate but therefore less elastic sound. Silence inhabits all great art. Silence is the perfectest herald of joy, exclaims Shakespeare. And Chekhov, whose plays unfold in an interplay of rhythms akin to musical compositions, gave the art of the rest subtle and tangible life. There's a moment in Act 1 of The Seagull when the bustle of conversation ceases and an unexpected quiet settles over the stage. A perfect stillness reigns until someone finally says, "The angel of silence has flown over us." Those were excerpts from an article in the Music in Mind section. It was written by David Blum in the current issue of BBC Music Magazine on the sounds of silence, and it was this week's Music News. Music is no longer a priority for many people. Youngsters are not being taught music as a matter of course, and good music is not a part of our national culture as it once was when people like Hosea Turby and Helen Traubel were guests on network radio shows such as Jack Benny and Fred Allen. Take time out of your life for the experience of listening to music, or, better yet, of making music. You're hearing the final edition of the national radio program for music lovers and audio buffs, Audiophile Audition, with me, John Sunier. I hope to turn the program's website into a streaming audio electronic magazine. If you're web savvy and computer savvy, look for our new domain name, www.audaud.com, in about 30 days. Our theme for this final program is Unexpected Instruments. We heard first there the combination of saxophone and pipe organ from the CD Antiphone Blues. Arne Domneris and Gustav Schockvist played a Largo by Vivaldi. Their CD has 15 tracks, including the title Blues, Ellington's lovely Come Sunday, Schubert's Traumerei, some spirituals, and some Swedish folk songs. It's a gold CD, and it's also HD CD encoded on First Impression Music label. The accordion-like waltz was from a Soviet composer named Joy, J-O-Y. It's titled Autumn Dream, and the player was Yuri Vostrolov on the bayan, a popular Russian button accordion used in their folk music. His 13-track album is from a series called Talents of Russia, and the archival recordings come from transcriptions of the Russian radio and TV. Some are as recent as 1988. You'll find it on the RCD label from Russia. And that closes out this program on the theme of unexpected instruments, and it also closes out 13 years, 3 months of a continuous national audiophile audition program for audio buffs and music lovers. I hope to hear from some of you at our new website and to provide new sounds at audaud.com, that's A-U-D-A-U-D, in about 30 days. This is John Sunier thanking you for your ears during any parts of that time and wishing you continued good hearing of good music.
You've been hearing Audiophile Audition with John Sunier. Listen again next week at this time to audition more high-technology recordings plus interviews with leading names in music and audio. And stay tuned for more good sounds on this station.